Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It is I, Carter the Brown, and I am here to react to the archetypal structure of the movie Gladiator. This is a clip concerning Jordan B. Peterson, a Canadian psychologist and YouTube intellectual who has become extremely popular over the past number of years. I'm a huge fan of the movie Gladiator, and so if he does not like the movie Gladiator, then I'm going to have to reconsider my feelings concerning him and everything he's ever said.
I would now like to discuss one of the best stories I've seen in modern cinema. I'm talking about the movie Gladiator. It came out in 2000, starring Russell Crowe and Joaquin Phoenix. You told me you saw it last night.
Yeah, I hadn't watched it before, so I knew we were going to talk about it, so I thought...
Yeah, I was very surprised by that. I
don't know how I avoided it.
Yeah.
Now and then there's a movie of substantial cultural significance that you just missed, and that was one I missed, so...
Yeah. Well, you made up for it. So, Gladiator. I think this movie is ingrained in the psyche of my generation more so than any other, like, epic movie of its sort. So there's other characters. There's Aragorn from Lord of the Rings. There's Hector from Troy. There's William Wallace from Braveheart. Yep. There's Spartacus. There's Leonidas from 300. All these characters are the same archetypal figures, but somehow only Maximus Decimus Meridius really sticks through the years. And I
think William Wallace sticks more.
I put some thought into this, and I have some ideas about why particularly this character and this movie sticks. I want to present to you 3 points that culminate in what I think is the implicit central thesis that runs throughout the movie. So I'm going to list now the 3 points and then the central thesis. Point number 1 is that Maximus is by far the best modern portrayal of the male archetype. So he's highly capable, but very gentle.
Braveheart more than Gladiator, but it's close.
And he's admired and loved solely for his character and skill. So that's the portrayal of the archetype. Point 2 is that the movie also contains the very best modern portrayal of the embittered villain, whose character and skill are simply insufficient, and he makes up for it through deceit and cruelness, while still knowing every step of the way that eventually he'll lose. There's nothing he can do about it. And 3, the characters themselves are exquisite in their own right, but in this movie they're juxtapositioned within a hostile brother framework, which makes it, which is a deeply archetypal framework, which might be the reason that it sticks so much more than all the other archetypal figures. And this brings me to the central thesis. And I only figured this out 2 days ago, and I'm very excited to get to share this with you. I think the central implicit thesis throughout the whole movie is as follows: that no matter how powerful someone is, the pain of a man whose soul has been irreversibly corrupted far exceeds the pain of a righteous man whose wife and son have been murdered and who's been reduced to abject slavery. Which is really something to think about.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, so the themes that you've been developing there. Well, so the first thing we might also note, though, that you glossed over, maybe that's the right way of thinking about it, is that Maximus is a paragon of soldierly virtue, right? He's a physical combatant, a warrior.
Yeah.
He's dutiful. He serves his commander, but also serves the principles.
Yes.
More importantly, serves the principles that govern his commander. And he serves the principles more than the commander himself. And you can tell that because he chooses not to serve the new emperor, Commodus.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because he doesn't believe that he abides by the proper principles. And Commodus, of course, also killed his own father, which means that he killed the principles by which the state, he's like the elder gods in the Mesopotamian creation myth who kill Apsu, who's their father, and then try to live on his corpse.
Wow.
It doesn't work out well for them. All that does is breed chaos, and that's exactly what happens in the movie Gladiator as well.
Yeah.
And Maximus as son is an interesting, S-O-N, is also an interesting character because he becomes son as a consequence of his virtue rather than as a consequence of his birth, right?
Yes.
Commodus has the has the advantage of birth, but Maximus has the advantage of virtue. But it's virtue. It's a virtue of strength, and that makes the movie, in some sense, also extremely barbaric. There's just endless death and killing, which is a very strange thing when you're talking about someone who's operating within a fundamentally moral framework. And I guess part of the moral of the story is that it's better to be a soldier than a coward. And it's not, I would say that on the one hand, that's self-evident, and on the other hand, that's a mystery. Because the coward might be able to avoid the mayhem and killing that characterizes the life of the soldier. Anyways, Maximus does organize himself under the virtues of courage and forbearance and strength.
Yes.
Yeah. So my observation is actually, of course, he's a very powerful soldier, but my observation is that is not the reason, not so much the reason this archetype sticks. How I read this character, that he is the absolute embodiment of the characteristics that allow you to contend with tragedy and malevolence in an optimal way. Not just on the battlefield. It's not really about the battlefield.
Right. Well, you see his soldierly capability as a representation of competence itself.
Yeah.
Competence guided by principle. Yeah, I think that's reasonable. And I also think that that's probably how the conduct of the soldier should be judged, right?
Yeah.
It appears that soldiers are necessary despite the mayhem that warfare produces.
Yeah.
We haven't figured out how to dispense with that necessity.
So do you think that the Cain and Abel framework, in which it is implicitly structured, do you think that adds to how much a story sticks?
Yes, definitely.
Why is that?
Well, because the story of Cain and Abel does lay out very, very elegantly and with incredible compression two fundamentally opposed modes of being.
Yes.
The mode of being that characterizes Abel, the favored son, and the mode of being that characterizes Cain. And
I can see how that
Abel
relates to
is
the movie.
competent and virtuous and God-fearing, let's say, but more practically, which means he's allied with the highest of principles. That's the right way to think about it psychologically. Whatever the highest of principles might be, there's an attempt. One of the things that you might consider psychologically is that the movement from polytheism to monotheism parallels the integration of the individual psyche and the development of larger and larger scale social organizations. All those things happen at the same time. So you imagine that the larger scale the organization, the human organization, so the more people included under the umbrella of the same state, the more organized and orderly the principles by which that state have to function must be, because of the increasing complexity and also the problem of having to determine how the state can remain intact over a long period of time without fragmenting. So the state has to organize itself so that the needs and wants of the bulk of the population are met with sufficient regularity so that the state itself doesn't fragment. And that means that the state has to organize itself in what you might regard as a virtuous manner that can be iterated. And at the same time, the people who compose the state in its increasing complexity have to ally themselves with that long-term state goal. So it's a coalition between psychological integration and sociological complexity. And that is foreshadowed, we might say, or accompanied by the movement from polytheism, which is the pulling of people in all directions by fundamental motivational and natural forces, into monotheism, which is the direction of the individual.
This clip is taking an interesting turn.
Set of principles, a single superordinate set of principles. Now, what those principles are is not obvious, which is partly why we're having the discussion of Gladiator. So I can give you an example of this. So, for example, in the Old Testament, you see the articulation of the guiding principles emerge in its most fully formed manner with the commandments of Moses. So you might say, all of the diverse forces that might pull people hither and yon have been aggregated into a list of thou shalt nots. Here's how to regulate yourself. Here's how to inhibit yourself across time so that you can have a stable, long-term, large-scale society. But then there's a mystery that emerges in the New Testament, which is, it emerges, for example, when Christ is asked by the scribes and Pharisees, which is the greatest of the commandments? And Christ actually performs a very intelligent sleight of hand, and he says, well, you have to love God with all your heart and all your soul, and you have to love your brother as if he's yourself, love your neighbor as if he's yourself. On those two propositions rest all the commandments and the law. There's an attempt to integrate even the commandments into something that's a higher order principle, and that higher order principle actually manifests itself in Judeo-Christian society as the logos, whatever that is. And it's something like truthful communication devoted towards the highest good. And the embodiment of that becomes the fundamental principle. And in Gladiator, you see movement towards that embodiment, right?
Yes.
Maximus is an organized and disciplined person.
He's also a sacrificial
who's governed by principle. The question is posed throughout the movie, well, what is Rome? Right? That's asked 4 or 5 times. It's asked by Marcus
was a dream
Aurelius
that was
because
Rome.
he feels that a lot of what he's done is a failure. It's asked by Commodus, and it's asked by the sister, whose name escapes me at the moment.
Lucilla.
Rome. It's what?
I think it's Lucilla.
Okay. And they all ask, well, what is Rome? And she comes the closest. She says it's a great idea. But it's not. It's an animating principle. And the question is, what is the animating principle? Now, whatever it is, Maximus embodies it far more than Commodus. And Maximus is a able figure, A-B-E-L, whereas Commodus is, or Commodus is clearly a figure of Cain.
Yeah.
He makes improper sacrifices, and they're never well regarded. He says constantly, that all he ever did was try to please his father.
Yeah.
Well, his sacrifices went unappreciated, and that's what made him bitter and resentful and murderous and doomed to a catastrophic death, and a figure of great evil and a tyrant and all of that. So yes, it's got a fundamentally archetypal structure.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack in that clip there. I overall was a big fan of that. I've watched Gladiator since I was very young. It's one of my favorite movies, and it's one of my favorite movies because it's a movie that provides a real male role model in Maximus. I mean, he's strong, but he's controlled, so he can be a monster, but he's controlled. He knows when to sheath his sword and when to unsheath it, and he has principles that he lives and dies by, literally. And so I've always been a huge fan of Gladiator. I know the Indian guy in there mentioned he thinks that Gladiator is the better movie when compared to Braveheart. I disagree. Braveheart is perhaps my favorite movie of all time in that, it's again, the William Wallace in that movie, divorced from the historical William Wallace, because the movie's wildly historically inaccurate. But William Wallace in that movie is he's so wild, but he's controlled. He has a purpose for his wild, unrestrained masculinity. He can control himself. He's not a Dan Bilzerian type. He doesn't just sleep around. He's controlled whenever he's around women. He protects women, and he lives by a certain set of principles and an ethic. And I don't know, I just love Braveheart so much. But it is true, Gladiator has a better villain, and the whole Cain and Abel aspect that they outlined in there, well, I had never thought about it that way before, but that really is the case. Maximus was chosen over Commodus because of his virtue and his his ethical principles that he embodied far better than Commodus. And Commodus hated Maximus for that, and hated his father for that. And so Commodus killed his father, and then of course the rest of the movie tries to kill Maximus because he was the favored son. I'd never thought about the movie in that way. That was just, I love that clip. It really, I'm so glad that Jordan Peterson liked Gladiator, because I would be very upset if he didn't. I would be a little dumbfounded. But he likes it. He sees what I see. He sees what this other gentleman sees. And so we're all good people. We're all good. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, those are my thoughts on the archetypal structure of the movie Gladiator. Now I want to know, what did you think of this clip? Leave whatever thoughts and comments you may have in the comment section below. And as always, if you like this video, please like it and subscribe, tell your friends about the channel. And now I leave you with this. My name is Maximus Decimus Meridius, commander of the armies of the north, father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and I will have my vengeance in this life or the next.